Welcome back. I'm going to try to solve some puzzles on chess.com today. You'll notice that I no longer list my peak rating down there in the ratings graphic at the corner of the screen. That's because I'm getting so far below the peak rating that it's not really relevant to show it all the time. But the current rating is still listed there for those of you who are curious as to what my rating is. If you're new here, I'm not a titled player, I'm not a chess coach, I'm not an expert of any kind. I'm just a random person trying to get better at chess. One of the ways that I do that is by solving puzzles. So I'm going to switch to the puzzle screen now, click puzzles, and I'm going to go. The idea of these is that you will learn to recognize certain positions or patterns so that you'll see them, spot them during games. And in certain situations, you might even be able to push to get into one of these positions during a game. Okay, I'm playing with the black pieces. I do have a couple of checks. I have one check that's down here. I think the rook would just capture. I don't think I would have a good follow-up for that. I have a check here. But I think the king would just capture, and I don't have a good follow-up for that. The reason I'm checking for checks, if you're not familiar, is that that's one of the things we should look for in puzzles. Another check I have is here. I do kind of like that one because that pawn is pinned. So before we go on to look for captures, like this hanging piece here, let's look at this check. This check forces only legal move is for the king to move over, and then I would have a follow-up check here on c4, pointed at the king this way. Wait, would that be mate? Is that checkmate? They can't. That's the only way they can get out of check. They can't capture the piece here. That pawn's pinned. None of the other pieces are attacking that square, so only one legal move is allowed. And then if I move my queen to c4 at that point, the king couldn't go back because the knight's still hitting that square. The knight's still hitting this square, and the queen would be hitting these. They can't block that. I think that's mate. The theme says passed pawns. If I go insane at some point in the near future, no offense to anybody who may be insane, this won't be the only reason, but I think it might help push me over the edge. There is a passed pawn in this puzzle, but that is not the theme. I'm going to thumbs down that and do mate in 2. Well, it took me a little while to see that, but I had to go through all the checks. The next thing I was going to go through is the captures. That piece, the knight was just hanging, but it probably wouldn't have been a good idea. I mean, they also had my rook here and maybe mate incoming. I don't know. Next puzzle. Once again, let's look at checks first. I do have a check here with my queen. They can't block that, but the king would be able to get out of check. I think that would be the only legal move at that point, king coming forward to f2. And then I could capture this pawn, which would be check again. Wait, I wouldn't want to capture it with my queen. I would want to take that pawn with my rook because that would be mate. This is a checkmate in 2, I think. Nothing can capture me there. Nothing can block that check. They would have to get out, and then this would be mate because my pawn's cutting off that square. All right, I got that one a little bit faster. No theme listed. Let's say checkmate in 2. All right, next puzzle. I think I have a mate in 1 here. Didn't see how they could get out of that one. My queen cuts off these squares and my bishop cuts off that square, and none of the enemy pieces were guarding d8 or able to block on e8. I'm honestly surprised I got these first 3, even though the first couple took a little bit longer than normal. I don't feel like I'm in the right headspace today, but I decided I do need to work on chess, and as usual, if I'm going to work on studying chess or solving puzzles, I should do it on video, because otherwise, what's the point of the channel? The point of the channel, if you're new here, is to document this process of me practicing and getting better at chess. So I just kind of forced myself to do it today. Don't know why I'm confessing this to you. I may edit this out later. I don't know. Feel like it needed to be said. Still trying to focus on this next puzzle. Again, I do have some checks in this position. 2 different checks, as a matter of fact. I think those are the only ones, so let's look at them. This check, only legal move would be for the king to come over, and then I could check here. My knight would be covering both of those squares, so they would have to take, and then this would be mate, I think. All right, so checkmate in 3. Oh, I got 15 points for that one. I like how the little graph kind of curves up. That's saying that I'm getting more points for the last couple than I got for the first couple. But it can't go any sharper than that because I think 15 or 16 is the max you can get for these, even if you solve them instantly. All right, next. There are several checks in this position, but I think this one is checkmate. And I went quickly trying to get a few extra points for it, but the idea there is none of the enemy pieces guard that square. And by virtue of the way that a knight moves, you cannot block it. So the only other option would be to move out of check. And of course, the king can't move to any of those squares right now. Okay, the other checks that we're looking at were this one. I thought, oh, I could win the queen, but I couldn't because the knight back there could have captured. So yeah, looks like that one was just mate in one. It says smothered mate. It is a smothered mate. It's also mate in one, so I will add that. Next puzzle. Enemy is enemy. The opponent is about to promote. I do have a couple of checks. One of them is this one. Is that the only check that I have? Okay, follow that out. There are a couple of legal moves in that. At that point, the rook could come up, but then I would just keep going. The king would have to move back, and then not sure what I would have at that point. But the king could move back first. If it did, I would have this check, which then the king could come back, and I would win the rook for a knight. But it needs to be checks all the way down, doesn't it? Because, well, that's not exactly mate, but it's really close. Checked me. I would be able to get out of it. So they don't have a mate in one. So it may not have to be checks all the way down. Maybe not. Okay. But that is my only check. So there's two options, right? If the rook comes up, I think I just take it, and then maybe I'm preparing something over here with the rook coming across to the h-file after that pawn moves. I'm having trouble visualizing how it's going to go after that, because that one is forcing. There's only two legal moves, but then the next move is a little harder. So if the rook does move up, I don't think I want to go down there because they would just take my queen. So I think I would capture it, protected by my knight. Then the king would have to move over, and then I would still have this, which would force the capture of the pawn, and then that would be mate. Okay, so what if the king moved over first? Then do I do that immediately? And then when the pawn captures, I come across and it's mate? I think. Okay, the rook did move up. Okay, so I need the king to be over there so my knight can check it. I'm going to check there, going to check here, and then here. Okay, that was mate in 1, 2, 3, is more than 3. Oh, mate in 3+ is already selected, so yeah, and I only got 5 points for that. You see the graph curving off more to a plateau shape there. Okay. It took me a while. There were more options. No, there were only 2 options on the first move. After that, the options were extremely limited, maybe down to 1. Okay. Again, the opponent does have a passed pawn and is about to promote. However, I have checks. Well, I have a check. That's my only check. And because my king is sitting here cutting off these squares and this rook is in the way, and then my rook there on g3 would cut off these squares, the king would be forced to move over. Well, not that way. One of these 2 ways. That's the only 2 legal moves at this position. Now, at that point, I could capture their rook, but then they could promote. But then I would check again on the h-file, and my king would be cutting off these squares from there, so their king could not move to protect that pawn. It would have to go that way, and I would win the queen, which is what I assume they would promote to. I think that's what's going to happen here. Oh, it moved there immediately. Oh, I didn't expect that. Okay, well, if I move here now, and they take my rook, and then I take the pawn, then it's a draw by insufficient material. So I need to move my rook at this point if I want to win. All the way back? I think it has to be all the way back to g1. Because then if they promote, again, I would check them on the h-file and win their queen. And if I just went back 1, the king continues to come toward me, and then I don't have that option anymore. And I can't check between them, like if I came back this way, I can't check between the queen and the king, because then the queen would just take my rook. So I have to go all the way back. Okay, and then here, and then win that. Okay, and then I do know how to checkmate with just a rook and a king. Not all of my opponents do. Got a stalemate just a couple of days ago in a bullet game because my opponent had the rook and didn't know how to mate with it. That's the level I'm playing at, apparently. I do so poorly in the rest of the game, I have to depend on my opponents not knowing how to checkmate at the end. Theme simple. Maybe simple means something different to other people, but I'm not sure what the theme is here. I'm actually going to add passed pawn for once. Not once, I've done it a few times. I'm going to add a passed pawn. I'm going to add promotion as a theme because it was about the promotion. It was about controlling how that promotion went and what I did about it when it was over, I guess. Oh, but I got 12 points for it. I didn't think I did it that quickly. Next puzzle. Okay, I do have a couple of checks in this position. One is the protected check on g1, protected by the knight. This square would also be protected by the knight, so the king would be forced to h3. And then I would have the follow-up check at that point of knight to f4, and my rook would still be cutting off this whole file, so the king would be forced to h4, and the knight would be protecting that pawn, and the rook would be protecting this pawn, so that would be mate there by playing g5, right? Now I could check with the knight first. The problem with that is that the knight is not protected, and the king could just come toward it, and if I checked again with the rook, the king would take my knight, so I think it has to be the rook first, which keeps the king off of this file and traps it onto the h file. Okay, and then it has to be that, and then g5? Yeah, because the knight covers this, the rook covers all these squares, and that is checkmate in 1, 2, 3. Next puzzle. I don't know why I almost always say next puzzle. Wouldn't it be obvious to you that I have clicked to the next puzzle? Maybe I just say that as a triumphant way of moving on. Like, I've dispensed with the lesser things behind me and going on to the next things in front of me. I don't know. I'll work on that. I just realized I was saying that every single time. Playing with the white pieces. I do not have a check with the knight. I do have a check with the queen, but that doesn't seem good, right? I also have this check, but that also doesn't seem good. And I have this check. Does that do anything? Okay, so I think those are my only 3 checks. Well, let's get rid of the queen ones first. That one I don't think is winning because the king would capture. My only follow-up check would be the knight down here, which is not good. Here, I think the pawn would capture, and then I wouldn't have any follow-ups at that point. Also, I think it's worth noting that I'm about to be in trouble here when they check me because I can't escape there due to their pawn, and I would have to go down, and then they have a rook right behind. They're going to end up trapping me down here pretty quick. Okay, this is the only other check that I have. Oh, I just saw that I can take their rook for my knight. I'm going to keep that in mind, but let's look at this a4 check first. My knight's covering those squares and pawn. My b pawn is covering these 2 squares, and of course my a pawn would be checking there. So the king would have, when my king is covering this square, so their king would have 2 options, either to go to a6 to get out of the way, in which case I could check here and king would have to go there, then I don't know what would happen. The other option would be to capture, which is what I assume they would do. But then I would check here with my queen on c6, and they would have to go down, and then that would be mate. Okay, so if they capture the pawn, I think I have a clear path to mate. Okay, so what if they don't capture the pawn? Oh, then I would have mate immediately. Okay, then it's probably that. Oh, they did capture the pawn. Okay, then I take here, and then that's checkmate, because my king cuts off those squares, so it can't get off the a file. All right, so mate in 3+, it was. I'm not going to say it this time. I'm just going to click the button that says. I couldn't read the button out loud because then I would have said it, and I said I wouldn't say it. All right, I do have 2 checks. 1, 2. I think those are my only 2 checks. In the case of knight to f6, they could capture, which destroys their structure a little bit, but I don't know how I would take advantage of that. This one forces the king over. And then we have the same thing we had in the other puzzle, except on the other side of the board, because the knight cuts off those 2 squares. I would check, the king would have to take, and then that's mate. Yeah, that was almost the exact same thing we had on the other side, moving the knight there to cover those 2 squares. I think in a game I would have been tempted to take that rook, but because I'm doing puzzles, I looked for this. That one was rated 1772. Not too bad, and we're about 20 minutes on my end, hopefully shorter on your end due to editing. Gotta love editing. Sometimes I just stare at the board like this. And I just look around, trying to figure out, well, I can take all that out in editing. Isn't that nice? Well, black to move. Okay, I'm playing with these pieces here, and I do have a passed pawn, and my opponent does have a passed pawn. Okay, well, I don't want to move that pawn. And that's the cool thing about these puzzles is that they're very limited set of options. I think the f-pawn, if I move it, they'll capture it. But if they captured it, I could come toward their pawn, but then they could come toward their pawn, and then I could come here, and then they would come here, and I would have to fight this pawn all the way down. Except they would probably get it to about here with their king next to it and me in the corner, and then they would go this way, and they would win my 2 pawns over here. So that's why I don't think I want to move that pawn. I don't think I want to move my king, especially away from their pawn, because then their pawn starts going and I can't catch it. I can't move my king here because their king is controlling that square. And if I move my king to any of the other possible places I can move my king, they get this pawn and again start shepherding that one down. For example, if I were to try to get in front of their h pawn, I think they could take this. I can't move toward their pawn because their pawn and their king would be cutting off those 3 squares. So I could go here, but again, they go back. And then I end up in front of that pawn, which would be a draw if those were the only pieces on the board. But again, they get me down here with their pawn there, and then their king starts going over here to eat my pawns. And I could get that one, but it would be too late. So I don't think I want to move either one of those pieces is what I'm saying. I think I want to move one of these 2 pieces. Pawns, I should say, but I don't know which one. If I move my b pawn, they would have the choice of taking or moving slightly past it or doing nothing. So if I moved my b pawn and they moved their h pawn, I could take that one, but then they would take back. They would have 2 pawns over here compared to my 1 c pawn, and I would be getting close to having trouble to catching theirs. So what about my c pawn? It has 2 choices. Sorry, I didn't do all the options here. If they took, they would have tripled pawns, but I can't get this one past those because all of those tripled pawns would be guarding squares on the c file. So they would have a couple of chances to let my pawn go and before they finally snapped it off at the end. So yeah, that doesn't seem good at all to me. And if they push, of course, then my b pawn is locked up and then this one's going nowhere. So I don't think I should push the b pawn. I think it's down to the c pawn, either c6 or c5. What happens if I play to c5? They could push and I could lock it up, and then these 2 pawns are not doing anything. They could push and I could take it. They could take back, and then those pawns would be locked up, doing nothing. I think if I played c5, they would just do that. Okay, so what if I play c6? Then what do they do? Push this pawn? If they do, I think I would then push this pawn. When they grabbed it, I would go here, and they can't get back next to their pawn. They would have to go this way, and I would get next to their pawn, and I would win it. But then their king would be closer to these pawns over here, and they maybe, I don't know, is there a way to win this? Or maybe it is moving my king. Maybe I should revisit that. Because earlier I said if I moved my king, then I would be away from this and wouldn't be able to catch it. But from e4, my king would be guarding this square, and then I could move my pawn. My pawn's closer to promotion. They would have to come to stop my pawn. And then I would move my king again to stay beside it. And then if they moved their pawn, I could move my pawn again, and they would have to get beside it, and then I would move my king again. And if they moved their pawn, then I would promote. Okay, wow. So I think it's moving my king. It was moving my king. All right, well then I should move my pawn. Is it going to go exactly like I said? It is going to go exactly like I said. Oh, and they didn't move one more, so I should promote. Nothing else makes sense. They promoted. Okay, well this one's easy because my king cuts off these squares. I'm going to check. They're going to have to go to that file, and then I will win their queen. Well, that took me way too long because I'd already discarded the king idea and then went on to look at all the pawn moves, but it was the king that had to move first. Theme was passed pawns and skewer. Sure. Also, I'm going to add promotion, and I'm going to click the green button, which is not shown on your screen, but it is on mine. All right, I do have a couple of checks in this position. One is the bishop check, but that leaves the king an escape square, and I could go back and check, but that doesn't do any good, right? I think that would be the king's only legal move at that point. And then my rook is lined up with it, but how do I, then what would I push the pawn at that point? They could just take and it'd be protected by the bishop. Wait, so do I need to get rid of that pawn first by something? Oh, if I move this knight out of the way, their c-pawn is pinned by my rook. Check. Okay, let's see, my bishop's cut off these squares. My knight would be hitting these 2, and that pawn would be pinned. So they would be forced into the back, and then that would be mate, would it not? I think so. Okay, let's do it. That was mate in 2. That is mate, right? They can't block the bishop. Okay, mate in 2. That's funny. The only reason I saw the knight move was because I was thinking about a way to get that pawn to keep from guarding this square. And so I thought about sacrificing the knight with this check to get that pawn to divert. But then once I realized once the knight's out of the way that the pawn would be pinned. That's how it happens sometimes. I didn't say it. I went to the puzzle after that one without saying those 2 words that I always say. Okay, well sorry, I'm not sure why they didn't take the bishop. Why did they not take the bishop? I don't know. I do have follow-up checks here. I have a check on e4 with my light squared bishop, at which point I assume they would take that one. Then I would have a check with my queen on f4, would force them back there, and then I guess I could check by taking this pawn, and they would take maybe, and then I would check with my queen, and that would be mate. Or do I have to go through all that? Should I just take this first? If I take the pawn first, they take here immediately. Then I check here, and they take the bishop. And then I check here, and they have to go back. And then I check here, and that's mate. Wait, does the order matter? I think maybe the order does matter. Let's see, because if I check here, they don't have to take. They could take the bishop. And then I would check with the queen first. And then they would have two options. That gets a little dicey. I don't know. I don't know. I'm going to check with the bishop first, but I could be wrong because I can't see the difference between that as the first move and this is the first move if I'm going to end up putting the rook here anyway at some point. The only reason to put the rook here is to get rid of that pawn so the h-pawn wouldn't be guarding this square anymore. So that when my queen is over here, I will be able to take on g4 with my queen. But it looks like I can't figure out whether the rook should go there first or after, so I'm going to go with the bishop first. Wait. One way to tell, okay, is it because here there's more than one move. That's what I just realized. They can block with the pawn. No, they can't because the pawn is pinned. Okay, maybe that's part of it. I take here, and then they take the bishop. When I go here, and they move out of check, then when I go to check with my bishop, then they can block with the pawn because it won't be pinned anymore. Okay, so I think the bishop first. Then here, right? They can't block that. Now with the rook, right? Because at that point, they can't. My queen and bishop are cutting off all these squares. They would have to take with the pawn. Then I would take with the queen. They would move over one, and that would be mate. Oh, it didn't go all the way to the end, so I can't add a theme of mate and whatever. That has a pass rate of 58.2. I almost failed that. And I don't even know if my reasoning was right or not. That my reasoning for going the order that I went was because this pawn could block the bishop check if I had used the rook first. But I don't know if that's sound reasoning or not. It's what led me to the right answer. But yeah, that has a 58% pass rating. I would expect it to be lower, but there we go. Oh, I've gone over 30 minutes and didn't realize it. Okay. If I counted right, I got 13, either 12 or 13 puzzles in this video. Hopefully you got something out of that. It looked like almost all of them were either checkmates or going toward checkmate. Like this one was almost checkmate, which is a little weird that it didn't end there. I'm pretty sure there's only one legal move for the king there, and then I would have mate by queen to g2. But anyway, hopefully you got something out of it. I got myself worked back into chess by the end of this session, which is a good reason, I guess, to go for it even when you don't feel like it. Because I certainly didn't feel like it today. I just knew that I needed to, because if I start going days without puzzle solving or analyzing games, that sort of thing, then it starts to get lost. At least at my age, I have to keep it up. So, thank you for spending your time here, and we'll see you next time.